Hey guys, tonight we're pulling on our scratchiest woolen hose, ducking under a thatched lintel, and stepping straight into the awkward, drafty, and wildly uncomfortable world of medieval dating. You're in a dimly lit hall, candle wax dripping onto your sleeve, and somewhere across the room, a potential partner is giving you a glance that could mean flirtation, or a mild case of indigestion. The air smells like smoke, mutton, and horse, and you're pretty sure someone behind you just sneezed onto the back of your neck. And here's the kicker. You're not just trying to impress someone. You're navigating rules so confusing, so crushingly formal that love itself feels like a feudal contract. Which, spoiler alert, it often is. So good luck, because between the church, your parents, and the goat that shares your bedroom, you're going to need it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a village square in the mid-13th century, your tunic freshly brushed, your breath kind of minty. Well, minty by medieval standards, meaning you chewed on a fennel sprig you found on the ground. You've spotted someone intriguing. They're standing near the well, carrying a bucket, and your heart does a little clumsy flip. You take a few steps toward them, trying to think of something clever to say, only to be intercepted by their uncle, who wants to know if you can read, how many pigs your family owns, and whether your soul has been cleansed of mortal sin. Because here's the thing. Dating isn't really a thing. Not in the swipe left, get coffee, see how it goes kind of way. Marriage is an arrangement, and the most romantic thing about it might be the negotiation over your dowry, which, by the way, you probably didn't get to help calculate. That charming well-side crush. Their family might already be hammering out an agreement with someone from the next manor over, one who owns actual iron tools. You meanwhile have a goose and 2 spoons. Still, people try. The heart wants what the heart wants, even when it's wearing pointy shoes and has never heard of deodorant. But you learn early that attraction isn't about personal chemistry. It's about politics, money, reputation, and occasionally, who can offer the most wool in a bad harvest year. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had any say in their romantic life, or if they just sort of shuffled into marriage the way you might agree to take over a neighbor's goat because, well, someone had to. In most rural communities, your love life is everyone's business, and your future partner is usually picked with the same logic someone might use to choose a plow horse. Strong back, decent teeth, and not too feisty. Now, if you're part of the gentry or nobility, things get even more complicated. Let's say you're the daughter of a moderately powerful baron. Congratulations. You're a bargaining chip in a vast web of alliances. Your hand in marriage could seal a truce, acquire new land, or settle a blood feud. You may have met your fiancé exactly once, and that was during a tense banquet where you spilled pottage on your only nice gown. Your father, though, thought he seemed like a capable man, because he once killed a boar and owns his own falcon. On the flip side, if you're a younger son of a knight, meaning you don't inherit land, you'd better develop either charm or ambition. The only way you're landing a respectable match is through careful negotiation, a strong chin, or, failing all else, becoming a monk. That, or you'll have to make do with stealing glances and writing bad poetry. Speaking of poetry, there's a chance, a tiny glimmer of hope, that your crush is from a family slightly less obsessed with pig counting and title swapping. You want to woo them, but even that has rules. You'll need to get your parents' permission to court. Yes, even just to talk to them with intent, and then your entire village will know by lunch. There's also the issue of logistics. How do you even meet someone new? There are no tavern apps. Most people never travel more than a few miles from where they were born. So unless you develop a thing for your cousin, which, statistically, you might, you're choosing from a very, very small dating pool. Possibly the same pool from which people also draw water, sheep, and disease. And you know what makes all of this worse? If you're a woman, you're not expected to want anyone in the first place. Female desire is either a theological puzzle or a problem to be solved with prayer. If you show interest, people whisper. If you don't, they arrange a marriage anyway. But don't lose hope. There are rare cases, precious, whispered about stories, of people who fall in love and somehow get away with it. Maybe a merchant's daughter catches the eye of a blacksmith's apprentice. Maybe they sneak away at midsummer, kiss behind the chapel, and somehow manage to get the priest to bless their union before the angry parents come storming in with pitchforks and contracts. Or maybe, just maybe, you write a clever enough love letter, sealed with wax, stuffed into a loaf of bread, and handed off by a sympathetic goat-herder, to win over your beloved's heart. But we'll get to the love letters in a bit. For now, you shuffle home, the glow of the village torches fatting behind you. You smell like damp hay. Your crush is probably betrothed to someone named Edwin, the balancer of accounts, and you've got a dowry meeting with your aunt tomorrow. Ah, medieval romance, isn't it dreamy? You wake the next morning to the sound of geese, loud, bossy geese, and the smell of porridge that's been boiling just long enough to taste like hot sadness. Your thoughts drift back to that almost flirt by the village well, but there's no time for longing when you've got chores, and your mother is already yelling about you being of age. You shuffle through your tasks, each one reminding you just how deeply unromantic daily life is. You muck the stalls, carry water, scrub something sticky off the side of a pot, and try not to think about your grim romantic odds. Still, that doesn't stop people from trying. Flirting does exist in the Middle Ages, it's just a lot slower and weirder. You're at a feast later that week. It's some minor saint's day, which means candles, dried fruit, and exactly one communal roast chicken. You spot them again, your maybe crush, their face lit by firelight and mead, eyes darting toward you, then away. You take a deep breath, brace yourself, and look at your feet. That's flirting, right? Turns out it kind of is. In a world where unsanctioned conversations between unmarried people could get you whipped or wed, depending on who saw, most courtship happens through gestures. A glance held too long, a dropped scarf, a song that might be about someone, or just about weather and goats. Historians still argue whether these coded actions were actually understood by their targets or just a way to look interesting while standing near a fireplace. If you're upper class, it gets more theatrical. You wear a certain color, or you embroider your sleeves with suggestive vines. Yes, vine patterns could be suggestive, don't ask. Nobles might compose poetry so densely symbolic it takes 6 monks and a bird watcher to decode it. You offer your beloved a token, a handkerchief, a garter, a frog-shaped brooch. Romantic if you ignore the part where the frog probably still smells like pond. And if you're a troubadour, well, then your job is flirting, professionally. You travel from court to court, singing songs of chaste longing and tragic love, hoping a noblewoman throws you a smile or a crust of bread. Just don't mistake her politeness for real interest. Otherwise, you might get tossed out a window by her husband, or her nun aunt, or both. But back in your less glamorous village life, flirting is subtler. You help with someone's hay, you fix their fence. You comment that their cow has shiny hair. It's not sexy, but it's what you've got. There are stories of couples exchanging flowers in the spring, symbols that carry a weight of meaning. A daisy might mean innocence. A thistle, I see you, but your dad hates me. A rose, bold move, might as well propose on the spot. Now, let's not forget the third party that oversees all these bashful glances and floral metaphors, the chaperone. You're never truly alone with your beloved. Someone's always hovering nearby. Maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's your Aunt Gertrude, who hasn't smiled since 1243. Either way, any moment of closeness is monitored like it's a royal treasury. That's why those rare, unsupervised moments feel electric. A brush of the hand as you pass a cup, a whispered joke during evening prayers, even dancing, when allowed, offers a brief escape. At local festivals, couples might pair off for a round of carol, the chain dancing tradition that's part social bonding, part opportunity to step on each other's toes and apologize profusely in Middle English. Of course, there are limits. You can't be too forward lest you be labeled loose. For women especially, flirtation is a delicate art. Too cold and you're called haughty. Too warm and, well, welcome to the village rumor mill. It's not electric powered, but it runs fast on spite and suspicion. And hygiene. Let's talk about it. Because you might be pouring your heart out in a love poem, but your breath smells like onion stew and your hair's been washed with rainwater and desperation. Perfume exists, but it's reserved for the wealthy and sometimes for corpses. For the rest of you, the best you can do is scrub with rosemary, hope for a windy day, and carry a nice piece of dried lavender in your pocket, right next to your last piece of bread. Then there's body language. You slouch slightly, not out of laziness, but because straight-backed confidence is for knights and liars. You try to smile, but you've got one visible tooth and it's trying its best. You make a joke, something light about sheep, and hope it lands. Humor, it turns out, has always been attractive. Historians still argue whether wit was more valued than wealth in peasant courting, but hey, at least you're funny. But even if the flirting goes well, even if you exchange flowers and scarf drops and suspiciously long glances, you still need your families to approve, because no one's dadding to see where it goes. It's either heading toward a binding contract, or it's just fuel for gossip. And if you go too far, if you get caught being too affectionate before marriage, the consequences range from forced betrothal to public penance, sometimes literally wearing a sack and confessing in front of the church with everyone watching. Nothing cools passion like explaining your sin to your neighbor while holding a chicken. Still, there's a strange sweetness to it all. These tiny moments of connection, woven between chores and sermons and lice inspections. You hold on to them, because they might be the closest thing to love you ever get before someone names you in a dowry document and decides your future for you. So next time someone says medieval life was simpler, remember the agony of passing your crush, a wilted daisy, under the stern gaze of a monk. And if they smiled back, that's practically a marriage proposal. You've managed to pass your crush a flower without dropping it into a muddy puddle or sneezing directly into their face. Progress. But before your heart starts composing a lute ballad, remember this. Expressing your interest in writing could be far riskier than charmingly awkward small talk under a thatched roof. Tonight, you're perched on the edge of your wooden cot, quill in hand, candle flickering like it's got stage fright. You're trying to write a love letter, not one of those steamy declarations from a romance novel. No, no. This one must walk the fine line between heartfelt devotion and political minefield. Because in the Middle Ages, the wrong love letter could cost you your freedom, or worse, your family's grain supply. You dip your quill into the ink pot, which is actually crushed gallnuts mixed with vinegar, yummy, and carefully begin. You want to say, I think about you when I see the stars, but you're worried it sounds too pagan. You try again. My heart is as yours as my sheep are to my field. Practical at least. Love letters in the medieval world are often grand, poetic, and laced with religious metaphors to keep them out of trouble. I worship thee as the saints above might mean you're cute, or please run away with me to Bruges. The problem: if someone intercepts that note, say, your beloved stern aunt or a rival suitor, your words might be read aloud in the town square, or presented as evidence in an ecclesiastical court. Because yes, church courts handled more than sin and scandal. They also handled matters of intent. If you promised love in writing, you might be held to it as a binding verbal contract. Historians still argue whether such notes counted as legal betrothals or just poetic ramblings, but it's best not to risk it unless you're ready to commit, or very good at disappearing into the woods. If you're of noble birth, the stakes are even higher. A poorly phrased metaphor could imply treason. Say your beloved is related to a duke. That innocent line about surrendering to love's army, someone might think you're planning an uprising. Medieval politics, where romance and rebellion are separated by one badly drawn heart. Now, if you do manage to send your letter, getting it into the right hands is another nightmare. There's no postal service, no secret pigeon network. You need a friend, a trusted servant, or a bored shepherd with loose morals and decent stamina. The letter might be hidden inside a pastry, tucked into a boot, or sewn into a cloak hem. All very dramatic, also very prone to goats eating it before it ever reaches the right person. Let's say your message does get through and your beloved writes back. Huzzah! You receive a scrap of vellum, hastily scrawled, folded with care, smelling faintly of lavender and pickled onions. You read their words by moonlight and your heart skips. They like you back. And now, you're both in danger. Because that mutual affection, unless immediately reported to and approved by every breathing adult in a 5-mile radius, is suspect. Unauthorized romantic correspondence can be seen as rebellion, manipulation, or even heresy, especially if you're flirting across class lines. A noble falling for a merchant's son. Scandal. A monk getting love notes from the miller's daughter. Double scandal, possibly with public lashings. Still, the desire to connect is so deeply human that people keep trying. There's even a whole literary tradition built around these secret longings. Ars Amatoria, the art of love. Manuals circulated in Latin, filled with tips on how to woo politely and passionately. Think of them as medieval dating guides, minus the cocktail recipes. One section might recommend praising your love's eyes like twin stars. Another might warn against using too many metaphors involving livestock. Among the most famous examples is the letter of Hales to Abelard, part of a real, tragic correspondence between a brilliant nun and her equally brilliant and occasionally clueless tutor. Their letters reveal passion, pain, philosophy, and also the clear reality that even in the uppermost circles of medieval intellect, love is a mess. A beautiful, wordy, ink-stained mess. But you're still staring at your half-written note, wondering whether to sign it with your full name, a cryptic symbol, or that one with the goose. You decide on a stylized flower, subtle, sweet, and plausibly deniable. The next morning, you bribe your neighbor's son with half a plum tart to deliver the letter. He agrees, shoves it into his tunic, and immediately forgets about it for 2 days. When he finally hands it over, sticky and slightly chewed, your beloved reads it behind the barn, turns pink, and sends you a handkerchief in return. Victory! Until, of course, your father finds the handkerchief and starts asking questions. Was it dropped? Lost? A sign of witchcraft? Who knows? He tucks it into his belt, muttering, and you spend the rest of the week anxiously counting chickens and practicing your innocent face. Still, there's something oddly exhilarating about it. These gestures, these fragments of connection, they matter. They're risky, yes, but they're also defiant in their own small way. You're carving a sliver of emotional freedom into a world dominated by duty and custom and relentless matchmaking. You tuck your next note into the hollow of an old tree, just beneath a carved heart. The ink's a little smudged, but it says what you mean. Meet me by the well on moonrise. I'll bring the goat. Medieval romance. 10% poetry, 20% anxiety, 70% livestock. It's market day and your town square is humming. Peddlers shout over one another about turnips and wool, children chase geese through mud puddles, and somewhere nearby, a priest is gently scolding a man who just tried to haggle over holy water. But none of that matters right now, because you're about to talk to someone you like, and so is their entire family. Because in medieval society, romance isn't just between two people. It's between two bloodlines, two sets of chickens, and sometimes two totally incompatible cheese-making traditions. You glance at your beloved, and then at their mother, their aunt, their second cousin, and that one neighbor who just kind of started tagging along for the drama. Flirting with someone means flirting with everyone they've ever eaten dinner with. You take a tentative step forward, and immediately your own relatives appear like summoned ghosts. Your older brother squints suspiciously, your uncle coughs disapprovingly, and your grandmother whispers a sharp "not them, dear," before vanishing back into the bakery. Welcome to medieval dating, crowd edition. Unlike modern romance, where the worst-case scenario is a third wheel or a nosy roommate, in the Middle Ages, an entire community plays referee. Your romantic life is public, parochial, and deeply political. The local baker's opinion might carry surprising weight, especially if they're also the one baking your family's communion bread. Families act as both facilitators and gatekeepers. If you're lucky, they encourage the match, perhaps even arrange some awkward alone time under supervision. Translation: a sheepdog watching you from 2 feet away. If not, they shut it down with breathtaking efficiency, moving you to another town, starting rumors, or worse, betrothing you to a second cousin with an impressive wine cellar and the personality of boiled oats. Historians still argue whether medieval families were genuinely invested in their children's happiness or just strategically managing labor, land, and reputation. The truth is probably both. Your affection might be real, but if your partner's family has a bad reputation, like that time they let their pigs wander through the monastery garden, you're in trouble. And heaven help you if you're from 2 rival villages. You think this was about class or land disputes, but no. It's about who invented the better lentil soup. Your crush might be lovely, but their uncle once accused your cousin of hay theft, and now no one speaks to anyone without yelling. Then there's the church. Priests don't just oversee the marriage, they oversee everything leading up to it. Premarital flirtation is a sin if it gets too warm, and they aren't shy about saying so. During Sunday sermons, a casual jab at those who tempt others with flowery words and low-cut tunics can freeze a courtship colder than February mud. But the church doesn't just moralize. It actively records, regulates, and when necessary, invalidates marriages. You might think you're engaged after exchanging oaths in a field, but if no priest or witnesses are involved, things can get dicey. Canon law is clearish, but interpretations vary wildly, and enforcement depends on local gossip, convenience, and whether or not the priest had his morning wine. Say your romance has survived the family politics and ecclesiastical oversight. You've exchanged letters, tokens, and exactly one awkward but meaningful touch during a festival dance. What now? Now comes the part where everyone, and we do mean everyone, weighs in. Your neighbors suddenly develop the gift of prophecy. One tells you the union is doomed because you both have red hair, an omen. Another swears your beloved once oversalted a stew, a moral failing. Even the town fool has an opinion. If you marry them, your children will grow up speaking in riddles. He might be right. No one knows. You attend a village gathering. Someone starts singing a ballad about star-crossed lovers. You're 90% sure it's about you. Someone else brings up that time your potential partner tripped into a pig trough, and suddenly the whole courtship hangs on how well you defend their balance. And still, beneath all this noise, your feelings pulse. You find yourself defending them passionately to your sister, who is unimpressed. You tell your brother that yes, maybe they did insult the local ale once, but isn't honesty a virtue? Your father grumbles something about dowries and cabbage futures, but you're already thinking about sneaking out again at dusk. Even if your family likes your choice, there are still negotiations. A formal betrothal often involves a meeting of elders, an exchange of goods, and sometimes an impromptu inspection of livestock. Your beloved's uncle might examine your family's cow and make cryptic comments about its udders. This is romance. And don't forget the marriage portion, a payment the groom or his family makes to the bride's family, or vice versa. It's supposed to guarantee stability, but sometimes it just guarantees haggling. You try to listen as your parents debate whether a spinning wheel counts as half a sheep. You wish you were back writing terrible love poems. Still, every now and then, things work out. 2 families agree, no property is seized, no friar throws a fit, and the baker even offers a free loaf for the occasion. The betrothal is announced, and for one brief, glowing moment, you're officially in love with permission. But for most, it's messier. Secret liaisons, forbidden letters, families torn between affection and tradition. And in the end, you don't just marry a person. You marry into their habits, their debts, their cousins, and their opinion about stew spices. Love in the Middle Ages. It's a group project, and the group has opinions. So let's say you've made it past the meddling families, the stern priest, the neighbor who insists your partner has shifty eyes, and the entire village peanut gallery. You've whispered sweet nothings behind the bakehouse, maybe exchanged a carved token, and after several dozen intense side-eyes from your grandmother, you've even secured a betrothal. Good news, right? Sure, until you remember that the law has ideas of its own. And in medieval Europe, love and legality are not exactly best friends. Because here's the twist, even if you think you're just dating or secretly engaged, the church and secular courts might already consider you married. Yup, without rings, without a feast, without even a priest. All it takes is one poorly phrased vow in the wrong field and congratulations. You're wed. This is thanks to something called clandestine marriage, a phenomenon that made dating feel like tiptoeing through a legal minefield. According to canon law, which governed marriage in most of Christian Europe, two people exchanging present tense vows like, "I take you as my wife," or "You and I are one forever" in private, with intent, could count as legally married even if there were no witnesses, priest, or family around. So yes, that sweet moment you shared during a midsummer festival where you declared your love under a tree, that might be legally binding. Historians still argue whether this rule was meant to empower couples against controlling families, or to trap them in obligations they didn't fully understand. Either way, it meant dating came with constant legal peril. Every conversation had to be carefully worded. Flirt too confidently, and you might accidentally become a spouse. Fail to back it up in public later, and now you're accused of abandoning your lawful partner. Romantic. Secular courts didn't make things much easier. Local customs varied, and while some followed canon law, others had entirely different rules about what constituted marriage. In some regions, even living under the same roof for a few weeks, especially with shared chores, might be seen as a de facto union. Suddenly, borrowing sugar turns into a binding contract. To avoid legal entanglements, some young people developed elaborate linguistic workarounds. Instead of saying, "I love you," they might say, "I love your soul's resemblance to a particularly noble goat." Poetic, vague, and not legally binding. Win-win. Meanwhile, enforcement was inconsistent at best. One village might ignore a private vow entirely, while another treats it as gospel. Some families used these ambiguities strategically, rushing a couple into a secret vow so they could then demand a dowry. Others used it to break up couples. "Ah, but didn't she promise herself to that cobbler 3 summers ago? That counts, doesn't it?" Then there were the annulments. If you found yourself accidentally married, perhaps after a slightly tipsy exchange of words during a harvest dance, you could appeal for an annulment. But the process was complex and humiliating. It involved testimony from witnesses, analysis of your words, examination of tokens exchanged, and sometimes bed linens. Yes, bed linens, because consummation changed everything. If a couple was found to have, let's say, sealed the deal, even unofficially, the church was far more likely to consider it a valid marriage. Proof could be circumstantial, witnesses seeing the couple leave a barn together, or, brace yourself, physical evidence submitted by the families the morning after. That's a level of parental involvement no one asked for. This led to a peculiar and unsettling phenomenon: couples accused of pre-contract, meaning they had secretly married and possibly consummated before their official wedding. Some were even dragged before ecclesiastical courts years later because someone remembered a suspiciously romantic sheep-shearing festival. "He said forever, Your Grace." I heard him. Oh, and if you were betrothed to one person but privately vowed to another. Well, now you've triggered a legal duel between two would-be spouses, complete with outraged families, scandalous rumors, and possibly someone being pelted with onions in the town square. It's no wonder that some couples tried to hide their relationship until the wedding feast. Better to risk a little gossip than end up married by accident, or worse, married to the wrong person because of a youthful slip of the tongue. Of course, not everyone wanted to follow the rules. Some couples did use clandestine marriage to their advantage, especially when their families disapproved. If you couldn't get formal permission, you'd simply run off to a quiet meadow, exchange vows, and return the next day insisting you were married and demanding recognition. It was risky, but sometimes the only way. Still, even this loophole came with consequences. If your private vow wasn't witnessed or later verified, your partner could disappear, deny it ever happened, and leave you labeled a fornicator, or worse, unmarriageable. Medieval society had a long memory for scandal and shorter tolerance for ambiguity. Your best defense: documentation and at least one nosy neighbor who was willing to testify. And then, hovering above all this, was the threat of excommunication. Break the rules too egregiously, say, marry someone without your priest's blessing, or get caught living as man and wife before a public union, and the church might drop the hammer. You'd be denied communion, shunned from mass, and whispered about at market stalls. Some communities even refused to bury those who died in a state of marital sin. That's right, dating gone wrong could literally follow you to the grave. So, as you can see, medieval romance wasn't just emotionally complicated, it was legally explosive. Every conversation, every glance, every offhand remark had to be weighed not just for its flirty potential, but for its possible standing in court. Love was a minefield, and you're walking through it barefoot with a rose between your teeth trying not to sneeze. So you finally tiptoed through the verbal traps and sidestepped the marriage by accident loopholes. You and your sweetheart have survived the meddling relatives, cryptic love letters, chaperone strolls, and the occasional near excommunication. It's time to settle down together, right? Wrong, because now you're 12. Welcome to the delightful world of medieval child betrothals, where dating becomes less about candlelit walks and more about trying to reach the table without a stool. You're not imagining it. Marriage in the Middle Ages often began shockingly young, especially among the upper classes. Noble families, in particular, treated their children like pieces on a dynastic chessboard. Your hand in marriage, just another move to forge an alliance, acquire land, or curry favor with a more powerful lord. Love, romance, or even basic personal chemistry didn't even make the priority list. Imagine being promised to a kid you've never met because your father owes their uncle a favor involving sheep and a disputed field boundary. That's the reality for many young people, particularly girls, who could be betrothed before they even learned how to spell their own name. Now, just to clarify, betrothal didn't always mean instant marriage. In canon law, the legal age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, and even then, consummation was often, though not always, delayed until the couple was a bit older. Still, the moment a betrothal was agreed upon, your romantic future was basically locked in, often years in advance. In practice, many of these early engagements were purely contractual, with the actual wedding reserved for a later date. But that didn't make things easier. If you were betrothed at, say, age 7, you might spend your entire adolescence preparing for a life with someone you barely knew, and in some cases, never really liked. Historians still argue whether such arrangements truly benefited the children or simply secured their families' political and economic interests. But in day-to-day reality, it meant you didn't have much choice. That sweet shepherd boy you admired from across the field, off limits. That witty kitchen maid who made your heart flutter, irrelevant. You've already been spoken for, possibly since before your front teeth came in. And heaven forbid you tried to break an engagement. Unlike modern dating, where ghosting someone might earn you a few angry texts and an awkward run-in at the market, breaking a medieval betrothal could mean lawsuits, family feuds, or public penance. If a formal agreement had been sealed with a vow or a token, and either party tried to back out, the local church court might force the marriage through, or slap you with penalties that could last for years. And then there were the age gaps. You've probably heard the horror stories. While child marriages between two children did occur, far more disturbing were the adult-child pairings, especially among the nobility. A 30-year-old knight marrying a 13-year-old bride wasn't exactly rare. In some cases, it was celebrated, proof that the family had made a strategic match. Romantic, not remotely. To be fair, many such unions remained unconsummated for years, and some older spouses acted more like guardians or tutors than romantic partners at first. But that line wasn't always respected. The church tried to maintain certain standards, but enforcement was spotty, and social norms varied wildly across regions and classes. Meanwhile, peasant marriages painted a different picture. Among common folk, betrothals still happened young, but full marriages usually took place later, closer to the late teens or early 20s. Why? Simple economics. You needed to be able to support a household before marrying. Land, tools, dowries, these things took time to gather. So ironically, peasants had a bit more romantic flexibility than their noble counterparts. But even here, romance was still a team sport. Families, neighbors, village elders, everyone weighed in. Dating privately was nearly impossible. If you were seen talking alone with a potential suitor more than once, rumors flew. You might find your mother accidentally joining your walk. The local priest might preach a thinly veiled sermon about young hearts wandering too soon. And suddenly, you're attending a betrothal negotiation with a boy whose only charm is that his family owns 3 oxen and a cider press. Quirky fact of the day. In some parts of medieval France and Germany, it was tradition for a young couple to lay in bed together, fully clothed, separated by a wooden board for a night of bonding before engagement. It was called a courting bed or bundling board, and it's exactly as awkward as it sounds. The idea was to test compatibility, read chemistry, but within strict physical limits. Spoiler, limits were not always respected. And if a couple went too far before marriage, well, that could trigger a forced wedding or worse, social ruin. For girls especially, a lost reputation meant everything. If you were suspected of losing your virginity outside marriage, your prospects plummeted faster than a cursed dowry. Some families even paid midwives to examine daughters before their wedding night to confirm their purity. Talk about pressure. So here you are, possibly 12, possibly already betrothed, definitely confused and surrounded by expectations you didn't sign up for. Your days are filled with spinning wool, memorizing saints' names, and occasionally being summoned to smile politely at the boy your father swears has very strong calves. Meanwhile, your actual emotions, nerves, hopes, attraction, are rarely consulted. Love, that's a luxury. You've got obligations. And if you're lucky, you end up liking your future spouse. If not, well, there's always poetry or nunnery. So as you practice embroidery with your future initials, or try to remember if you're marrying the baker's son or the tanner's nephew, just know, dating in the Middle Ages didn't wait until you were ready. It started when your parents said so, and you just had to grow into it. So now you're betrothed, possibly against your will, certainly without Tinder, and maybe, just maybe, you're hoping that at least you can make a good impression. You want to seem presentable, charming, irresistible even. Too bad medieval hygiene has other plans. You've just stepped into the world of medieval personal grooming, and let's just say it's not winning any awards for romantic allure. In fact, in many places and periods of the Middle Ages, smelling good could actually be suspicious. Perfume, cologne, herbal bath sounds a little too French, or worse, witchy. Let's begin with the basics. You wake up on your straw-stuffed mattress, maybe in a wooden house with a dirt floor and drafty shutters. There's no running water, no toothbrush, and your idea of a morning routine is maybe splashing your face from a basin, rubbing some rosemary on your pits, and hopping for the best. Full-body baths, rare and for most people seasonal. Some towns had public bathhouses, yes, but they were often tied to rumors of sin, scandal, or general indecency. In fact, after the Black Death, many bathhouses were shuttered altogether under suspicion that they spread disease or tempted good Christians into steamy, soapy sin. If you were wealthy, you might have access to a private bath, a wooden tub hauled indoors and filled by servants with hot water from the hearth. Scented oils and herbal sachets might be tossed in. Sounds cozy, right? Well, unless you were trying to impress someone. Because here's the twist. In certain religious and moral circles, bathing was seen as vain, possibly even dangerous. There was a belief, especially among more pious thinkers, that opening your pores through bathing allowed evil or illness to enter the body. Some monks would go months or years without washing more than their hands or feet. You just wanted to look good for a date, but now you're being told your clean hair is suspicious. Perfume wasn't much safer. While some people used aromatic herbs like lavender or rosemary to freshen up, tucked into clothing, sewn into pouches, or even worn as necklaces, strong fragrances could be interpreted as either seductive or sorcerous, especially if you were a woman. Historians still argue whether scent was truly feared or just associated with certain social classes, but one thing's clear. If you smelled too nice, someone would probably whisper that you were trying to enchant a lover, or worse, the parish priest. After all, who but a harlot would wear rosewater in the middle of Lent? That said, medieval people were not completely nose blind. They hated bad smells just as much as you do. They just had fewer tools to combat them. One quirky fact, teeth cleaning did exist. People chewed sticks of licorice root or mint, scrubbed their teeth with linen cloth, and sometimes even made early versions of toothpaste using crushed herbs, charcoal, or ground oyster shells. Effective, debatable, pleasant, unclear. But if you're lucky, your betrothed might only have 3 visible teeth, one of which is only slightly black. Hair, on the other hand, was a bit more straightforward, especially for women. Long braided hair was a symbol of virtue and fertility, and letting it flow freely was considered flirtatious, which meant, you guessed it, modesty required a head covering. A veil, wimple, or coif was expected in public, especially for betrothed or married women. So if you wanted to show off your hair to a potential match, you'd have to do it in private or risk being called indecent. Men weren't exempt either. Beards were status symbols, but they had to be just right. Too unkempt and you were a vagabond. Too carefully styled and you were vain or French. That's the constant medieval fear. Doing anything too much invited suspicion, mockery, or sermons. You had to look accidentally attractive, like someone who just woke up blessed by Saint Valentine himself. And let's not forget the clothing. Unless you were a noble, your daily wear was likely made from coarse wool or homespun linen. Dyed clothes were expensive. Bright colors, especially blue or red, were associated with wealth or romance. But wearing too many bright colors, scandalous. A commoner in red hose might be accused of peacocking, or worse, trying to woo above their station. You walk through the market, maybe with a sprig of mint behind your ear, your tunic only moderately patched, and people are already whispering. Looks like someone's looking for a match, the old ladies cackle from their window. Great. Now the baker's apprentice knows you're interested in someone. Too bad it's not him. Trying to flirt, you better be subtle. If you make eye contact for too long, you risk being accused of witchcraft or just being forward. A smile, fine, but only if it's brief. Prolonged smiles are basically medieval sexts. Want to offer a gift? Maybe a token of affection like a ribbon or a carved spoon. Careful again. Gift-giving among unmarried people could be taken as a marriage promise, especially if done in front of witnesses. You thought it was just a nice gesture. Now you're halfway married by mistake. And here's a delightful fringe belief to round things out. It was widely thought that certain foods and smells could either attract or repel love. Garlic was protective, but also, well, garlic. Cinnamon was exotic, expensive, and potentially erotic. And fennel, good luck. Some medieval herbal guides claimed fennel cools the passions, making it the worst predate snack possible unless your goal is to bore someone into celibacy. So here you are, trying to prepare for a romantic evening, or at least a respectful chat about oxen, with the odds stacked firmly against you. You can't bathe too much. You can't wear too much color. You can't smell too nice. And your teeth are fighting a losing battle with whatever passed for dental care in 1347. And despite all this, you still want to impress someone. Maybe even make them laugh. Maybe even hold their hand while the candlelight flickers across the stone walls. Just remember to avoid eye contact for too long. And no cinnamon unless you really mean it. You're finally invited to court. Not court like see you in front of the judge, but court as in the court. A place where noble lords and ladies glide down long hallways draped in brocade, where minstrels play delicate lutes, and where everything you say is filtered through 12 layers of etiquette, poetry, and vague, aristocratic yearning. Welcome to the surreal realm of courtly love. It's glamorous. It's romantic. It's also, quite possibly, the most frustrating dating system ever invented. You walk in expecting some casual mingling, a little flirtation by the wine table, maybe a nice dance or two. Instead, you find yourself in a very delicate performance. You are meant to pine, longingly, possibly while sighing into a candle-lit window as soft music plays and the object of your affection dances with someone else entirely. You don't flirt, you suffer. That's the essence of courtly love. This whole thing started in the 12th century, mostly in the courts of southern France and northern Italy. Think a leaner of Aquitaine, troubadours, and lots of florid verse. The idea was that love, true, noble love, was supposed to be unconsummated. That is, you're supposed to adore someone from afar, praise their beauty and virtue in agonizing detail, and never ever act on it. Romantic torment was the goal. And the person you're supposed to adore, often married, ideally to someone else, usually someone far above your station. You write sonnets. You compose songs about their hair, their fingers, their laugh, the way their shadow falls across a stained glass window. You give them a token, a scarf, a ring, a pressed flower, and they might give you a glance, maybe even a smile, and that's it. Game over. Well done, Romeo. Historians still argue whether this whole ritual was ever really practiced by most people, or if it was more of a literary fantasy. Did knights and noblewomen actually live this soap opera, or was it just something you read in a verse romance before bed? Either way, it shaped how people thought about love for centuries. You, of course, just wanted a little affection. But now you're in a world where showing physical interest is vulgar, directness is disgraceful, and if you actually manage to hold hands with someone, you might as well start planning your exile. Let's say you're a knight. You've just returned from a crusade, your armor is still flecked with dust, and all you want is to confess your feelings to the lady of the manor. But you can't. You must instead compose a chanson, a melancholic ballad in which you compare her to the moon, the rose, and the unattainable shimmer of morning dew. If you're lucky, she might give you her glove. If you're unlucky, her husband might give you a sword to the liver. Still, this emotional theater had its perks. For women, especially noble women, it gave some power in a deeply unequal society. While marriages were arranged and options were limited, courtly love allowed a woman to be admired, to set the rules, and to play the game on her terms. At least in theory. One fringe fact: knights would sometimes wear their lady's undergarment, a garter, a sleeve, even a girdle, wrapped around their armor during a tournament. As a sign of devotion, of course. Today, that would be like tapping your crush's sock to your gym bag and calling it romance. Want to show you're interested? Don't speak to her, speak about her, publicly, in poetry, over and over again. You'll become a walking press release of emotional suffering. Want to make a move? Joke on you. Touching is a scandal. Even dancing is regulated, often done with at least 1 or 2 handkerchiefs between you. And yet somehow, these stifling traditions trickle down into other layers of society. The merchant's daughter who reads romances under candlelight. The apprentice who sneaks into a minstrel show. Everyone wants that noble ache, that beautiful, unfulfilled longing. It's tragic, yes, but it's also a form of escapism from lice, debt, and chronic trench foot. Of course, real relationships still happen. Affairs, scandals, love matches, all that mess continued behind closed doors or barn doors depending on your rank. But publicly, the ideal was pain, poetry, and purity. You're stuck now. You've played your lute. You've sighed your sighs. You've tied your lady's handkerchief to your sword hilt. You've listened to an entire troubadour song comparing her smile to a dying swan. And you've still gotten exactly 0 steps closer to actually dadding. But oh, the gestures. One man once promised to leap from a tower to prove his devotion. Another reportedly refused food and starved himself after being rejected. That's the bar, my friend. Actual starvation. You sent a rose emoji and thought that was enough. There's also the coded language. You can't say, "I like you." You must say, "My heart is pierced by your gaze, milady, and I am but a lowly servant to your splendor." And even then, she's probably married to your cousin. And the moral of the story, love, proper love, isn't supposed to be convenient. It's supposed to elevate you spiritually, purify your soul, make you weep into your goblet of mead. There's an undeniable beauty in it, yes, but also a heavy dose of absurdity. Imagine writing 6 poems, performing a lute solo, and riding a horse through the rain, just to maybe get a nod from someone who's already married to a baron. So you bow, you smile, you compose a few more verses about how her eyes remind you of early frost on the chapel window, and then you go home and lie awake staring at your thatched ceiling, wondering how your love life ended up as a slow-moving medieval opera. But hey, you're being emotionally noble. That's worth something, right? You're tired of poems, tired of lutes, tired of sighing at windows while your crush casually marries someone else for land. You want results. You want someone to actually like you back, maybe smile without 3 layers of metaphor. So, what do? You turn to the real magic of medieval dadding. Potions, charms, and love magic. Yes, welcome to the world of whispering hedge witches, dried herbs under mattresses, and suspiciously red concoctions bubbling in pewter pots. Because if courtly love was all pinning and restraint, love magic was for the desperate, the bold, and the occasionally unhinged. You live in a time when medicine, superstition, and magic aren't clearly separated. If a local healer gives you willow bark for a headache and also sells a powder to make someone fall in love with you, well, who's to say one works and the other does? Let's say you walk into a village apothecary. The shelves are cluttered with glass vials, bundles of dried roots, wax-sealed jars with cryptic symbols. You whisper to the herbalist that you've been afflicted, love-struck, tormented. They nod naturally. There's a powder for that. Maybe made from crushed beetles, wild roses, powdered emerald, expensive, or something slightly weirder, like hair clippings and fingernail shards. You swallow it, you smear it on your skin, you slip a drop into someone's ale, because subtlety isn't really the point, outcome is. Historians still argue whether these love charms were more about placebo than potion. Was it the potion that worked, or just the confidence boost of thinking you done something? But make no mistake, people truly believed. Not just peasants either, nobles, monks, even kings turned to magical means when love turned sour. In 14th century France, a noblewoman was once accused of bewitching a duke using a potion made from menstrual blood and crushed pearls. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval chemistry did not follow FDA guidelines. And it wasn't just about getting someone to fall in love with you. There were also anti-love spells, charms to end someone else's romance, prevent an unwanted marriage, or ward off obsessive suitors. Some carried talismans with verses from the Book of Solomon. Others tied knots in string while muttering prayers backward. You know, casual Saturday stuff. One quirky tidbit. Some regions believe that burning a frog and keeping its ashes in your shoes would make you irresistible, which explains the smell, but not the success rate. But here's the thing, dabbling in love magic wasn't exactly legal or safe. The church kept a sharp eye on these things. Using charms or potions could get you accused of witchcraft, especially if your efforts worked a little too well. So if your village crush starts spending time with you right after you left a mysterious bundle of herbs under their doorstep, be careful. The town priest might not think you're romantic. He might think you're possessed. There's even documentation of trials where women and occasionally men were interrogated for using demonic influence to bend another's will. Some confessed to using enchanted oils, whispering Latin backwards, or drawing hearts with chalk under doorways. Others claimed innocence. Still, trials happened. Punishments varied: penance, whipping, even death, depending on how dramatic the love story had been. And heartbreak, that was its own kind of curse. There are records of people wasting away from love sickness. Yes, that was a real diagnosis. Physicians sometimes treated it with music, baths, and, ironically, relocation. You were prescribed travel to get over someone, or leeches, because medieval medicine always involved leeches. Of course, not everyone who tried these things was some shady sorcerer in a hooded cloak. Sometimes it was your neighbor, your aunt, the midwife. And sometimes, love spells were wrapped into Christian rituals: lighting a candle to Saint Valentine, writing your crush's name in a psalter, or fasting while reciting a special prayer. Blending the sacred and the superstitious was an everyday dance. And as you trudge home from the apothecary, clutching a wax-sealed pouch that smells like goat hair and rosemary, you wonder, is this really what dating has come to? Mixing secret potions by firelight. But maybe it's no stranger than what you've already tried. Remember the troubadours, the chaperones, the marriage contracts that require your entire flock of sheep. You tuck the packet under your pillow, just in case. Because in a world where romantic outcomes are dictated by dowries, family alliances, and church rules, sometimes the only power you have is in a jar of suspicious pink powder. One more fringe case. In 15th century Germany, a woman reportedly enchanted her ex-boyfriend into marrying her again by burying his toenail clippings inside a hollowed-out turnip at a crossroads. Did it work? Allegedly, yes. Did the marriage last? Probably not. But honestly, points for creativity. So whether you're slipping herbs into someone's wine or whispering incantations under the full moon, remember, love in the Middle Ages wasn't just a battlefield. It was a witch trial waiting to happen. And as you blow out your candle for the night, the scent of rose oil and powdered toad still lingering on your fingertips, you can't help but sigh. Dating a nightmare. Magic questionable. But at least you're trying. You probably thought things couldn't get much worse than frog ashes in your boots and love potions brewed from toenail clippings. But oh, you sweet medieval summer child. Now we enter the true realm of heartbreak horror. What happens when things go wrong? Not just awkward dinner date wrong. We're talking stocks, public shame, and occasionally excommunication. You've managed to court someone, maybe even sneak a hand touch beneath the barley table at a feast. Congratulations. But if your wandering eye or theirs leads to infidelity, you'd better hope your village has a very short memory. Because in the medieval world, cheating was both a sin and a community event. Let's set the scene. It's market day. You're passing the fish stall when you notice a man being marched into the town square with a shaved head and a placard hung around his neck reading, "Adulterer." Kids are throwing turnip peels at him. A drunk bard is improvising a humiliating ballad. The stocks have been cleaned for the occasion. This is your warning, don't get caught. In medieval Europe, adultery was more than just a moral failing. It could ruin your entire social standing, especially for women. A married woman caught cheating might be paraded through town in her shift underwear, holding a candle as penance while everyone jeered. And if her husband decided not to forgive her, she could be locked away, disinherited, or, depending on the region, branded with hot iron. Men didn't get off lightly either. A cheating husband might have to pay a heavy fine, do public penance, or in rare cases, be subjected to trial by combat. Yes, fighting another man in defense of his honor, occasionally while seated in a wadding pool. Historians still argue whether these duels were more symbolic or actual murder-like entertainment. But the punishments weren't always violent. Sometimes they were weirdly performative. In certain parts of Italy, adulterers were made to wear a sheep's mask and bleat like goats while walking through town. In northern France, they might be tied together naked and left to explain themselves to the crowd. Love letters, publicly read aloud, every mushy line, every cringy nickname. Oh, and let's not forget about the cucking stool. This was a chair, often attached to a long wooden beam, used to dunk someone, usually a scandalous woman, into the nearest river repeatedly, all while the village watched, ate apples, and pointed. Now let's say you weren't technically married. Maybe you were engaged, maybe just getting to know each other. That didn't get you off the hook either. Medieval communities held a fierce belief in communal morality. So if two people were known to be stepping out together and then one was seen with someone else, neighbors might spread rumors, summon the local bishop, or worse, report it to your employer. One fringe tidbit from 13th century Yorkshire. A woman caught canoodling with two men was sentenced to sit atop a wooden donkey with a sign that read "Faithless like Judas," and then paraded during the harvest festival. Ironically, she later married the town baker, who apparently had a thing for dramatic flair. In noble circles, cheating came with even higher stakes. A queen accused of adultery could lose her crown or her head. Look no further than Anne Boleyn. Though historians debate whether she actually cheated on Henry VII, the accusation alone was enough to justify her execution. Court rumors were deadly weapons. But even when death wasn't on the table, reputation was everything. A scandal could stain your lineage. If you were a noblewoman with a rumored affair, your future children could be declared illegitimate. No inheritance, no titles, just a lifetime of side-eye at tournaments. And what if you were falsely accused? Well, good luck. Trials were often based on hearsay, circumstantial evidence, like being seen alone after dusk, or good old-fashioned envy. Defending your honor might mean swearing an oath on relics, submitting to ordeals like carrying hot iron, or, if you had the coin, bribing a witness to remember things differently. It's also worth noting that the church played referee in these matters, and not always fairly. Monks and priests were expected to maintain celibacy, but rumors of affairs and secret children were shockingly common. Irony dripped from every sermon on chastity, especially when the preacher had a housekeeper who never seemed to leave. Even the punishments varied wildly by place and century. In some Scandinavian towns, a man caught with another's wife had to pay compensation in salted herring. In parts of Eastern Europe, women were publicly shamed by being made to sweep the streets wearing only a shift and a crown of garlic. Historians still debate whether these bizarre local penalties were symbolic or simply sadistic civic theater. But sometimes the punishment came not from law but from revenge. A scorned lover might spread malicious rumors, carve insults into your door, or, if they had money and motivation, hire someone to curse your cows. Yes, cow cursing was a thing. A particularly tragic medieval breakup once ended in all 5 of a man's goats walking into the sea. Coincidence? The ex-girlfriend was a known herbalist. So you learn to be careful. Keep your flings quiet. Burn your letters. Don't smile too long at anyone who owns a candle-making business or has a cousin on the parish council. Because love is lovely until it gets lit on fire and tied to a donkey. You tuck your scarf tighter around your neck, eyes darting at the gossiping laundresses by the well. They're not talking about you yet, but all it takes is one misunderstanding, one stolen kiss, and you could be starring in next week's morality play. Medieval dating wasn't just hard. It was a public sport. And the crowd always wanted drama. The sun is finally out, the fields are greening, and your woolen cloak doesn't smell quite so much like boiled onions. That can only mean one thing in your medieval village. It's festival season. Time for dancing, drinking, and, if you're unlucky, dueling some guy over a misunderstood compliment about his sister's braid. See, if day-to-day romance was a tangled mess of superstition, social control, and chamber pots, then festivals were the chaotic wild card. These were the moments when villagers, peasants, and even traveling nobles shook off the mud of obligation and just for a while pretended they were free. At first it's delightful. The maypole goes up. Musicians arrive with flutes, lutes, and questionable dental hygiene. Girls wear flower crowns and linen dresses, and the boys pretend not to care but definitely keep glancing over. You catch someone's eye. Maybe they hand you a honey cake or slip you a charm, a carved little love token tied with a piece of dyed wool. Things feel magical, but also dangerous. These open-air flirtathons had rules, mostly unspoken, mostly ignored. A smile too long, a dance too close, or the wrong kind of toast, and suddenly you're not in a courtship, you're in a contest. One famous example, the Pea Festival of 14th century Devonshire. Local legend claims a man named Oswin complimented another's fiancée on her embroidery, and 3 hours later, the men were fighting with wooden shovels in the cabbage cart. A priest had to break it up, and both were banned from the next year's festivities. Historians still argue whether these festival duels were about actual affection or just public posturing in a world with few outlets for ego. Either way, you, dear listener, are now being watched closely by 3 old women, 2 pig herders, and a merchant's apprentice. All of them just saw you accept a flower garland from someone who may or may not already be betrothed. No pressure. Now let's say you do pair off. The sparks are flying, and you duck behind a hay cart to steal a quick kiss. Sounds romantic, right? Except now you've crossed into the realm of ritualized courtship games, some of which are barely distinguishable from medieval speed dating. If speed dating came with wooden masks, suspicious rhymes, and occasional pig races. In many regions, games like apple bobbing weren't just for fun, they were subtle matchmaking events. You'd be paired by lottery, asked to carry your match across a puddle or sing a verse about their hair without laughing. If you succeeded, everyone would hoot and holler. If you failed, they might throw bread at you. Hard bread. And if your festival happened to fall around spring equinox or May Day, hoo boy. Those celebrations were especially charged. Many were rooted in old fertility rites, which, by your time, had been awkwardly Christianized, but not entirely forgotten. The village elders would pretend not to notice the couple slipping off into the woods, but the smirk said it all. In some places, greenwood marriages happened, temporary unions solemnized by, well, mostly just giggling and ale. They weren't always legal, but they were tolerated, especially if both families agreed to make it official later. It was a trial period for matrimony, minus the lawyers. One fringe tidbit. In a Bavarian village in the 1300s, records mention a midsummer king elected each year to judge flirtation contests. His crown, made entirely of bread rolls and fish bones. His court, 3 goats and a boy with a tambourine. Love and madness were never far apart. But festivals also carried darker risks. With all the drinking, dancing, and pushing of boundaries, jealousy festered fast. If 2 people fancied the same person, especially someone of higher social standing, it could erupt, not just into arguments but into full-on violence. You remember that basket weaver who complimented your garland. He's now glaring at the thatcher's apprentice who handed you a carved spoon. They're posturing, sleeves rolled up, and you're caught in the middle like a badly chaperoned cheese wheel. Sometimes, to prevent violence, local authorities enforced festival watches, where elders or low-level guards wandered the crowds to separate brawlers. Other times, they simply let them fight it out, provided nobody lost a limb. And if you thought the duels only happened among men, think again. Women also had their moments of rivalry, though the weapons were more psychological. Passive-aggressive embroidery, sarcastic compliments, and the always lethal accidental wine spill on your dress move. Love may be a battlefield, but in a medieval festival, it's also a stage. Still, these events weren't all chaos and bruised egos. For many, this was their only real shot at meeting someone outside their parish. Travel restrictions, short lifespans, and social hierarchies meant festivals were rare windows of romantic opportunity. You didn't just come to dance, you came to hope. Which is why, as dusk falls and the fire jugglers start their routine, your heart races. You're standing at the edge of the circle, candlelight flickering on faces, music lilting through the smoke. Someone reaches out a hand to dance. Maybe it's the garland giver, maybe it's someone new. You take the hand. For a few minutes, nothing matters but rhythm, warmth, and not stepping on their toes. The night is young, the crowd is cheering, and your heart, bless it, is trying very hard not to betray you with giddy excitement. But just remember, in the morning the rumors start. The rooster hasn't even finished crowing when you hear it. Hoofbeats, fast ones, more than one rider. And before your porridge even has time to cool, you get the sinking feeling that your love story just turned into a manhunt. You see, when courtship rules are strict and families treat marriage like a business merger, love has a habit of sneaking out the back window, literally. Eloping in medieval times wasn't just a romantic notion, it was often the only option. Whether you were a young noblewoman fleeing a forced match or a peasant couple denied parental blessing, running off together was a tradition as old as the marriage contract itself. And yes, there were runaway nuns involved. We'll get there. Let's imagine it's you. Last night at the festival, you and your beloved locked eyes across the mead table, exchanged a flower token, maybe even a kiss behind the thatched granary. But this morning, you overhear their family talking about a very advantageous match with someone who smells like boiled leather and owns 12 pigs. Time to move. You grab a cloak, a few coins, and maybe a dried apple. Your partner, already waiting at the edge of the woods, looking equal parts thrilled and terrified. Off you go, into the trees, dodging brush and brambles, hearts thudding like war drums. This wasn't uncommon. In fact, by the 13th century, there were so many elopements across Europe that towns began creating rules about where and how couples could marry, mostly to stop them from tying the knot in secret. Some clergy were happy to oblige elopers, especially if they were slipped a coin or two, but others refused outright without family witnesses or public declarations. Here's a historical nugget. In 1215, the church introduced a new requirement called banns of marriage, 3 public announcements made in church before a wedding could happen. Why? To give time for someone to shout, "Wait, that's my daughter," or "He's already married to my cousin." It was the medieval version of speak now or forever hold your peace. But if you eloped outside the system, say with no priest or with a rogue friar in a barn, you entered murky territory. The marriage might be considered valid if consummated, and if both parties agreed they were doing it of their own free will. But it could also be challenged later. And yes, you could be excommunicated for it. That brings us to the runaway nuns, the quiet rebels of convent life. While some took vows willingly, others were placed in convents by families who couldn't afford a dowry or just wanted fewer mouths to feed. A few, upon discovering love or lust or just the lure of the outside world, staged daring escapes. One record from 14th century France tells of a nun who disguised herself as a pilgrim, escaped through a laundry cart, and ran off with a traveling scribe. The church was furious. The lovers were caught, tried, and separated, but not before becoming minor legends in the nearby villages. Even today, some scholars debate how many of these escaped tales were real and how many were moral fables in disguise. Let's say you evade your pursuers. You and your partner find a sympathetic priest, maybe one who owes a favor or has a soft spot for young love. He mumbles the rites under a fig tree, blesses your union with a cross made of twigs, and tells you to lay low until the heat dies down. Congratulations, you're married. Except what now? You probably don't have much money. You may have burned bridges with your families. and society doesn't exactly throw parades for elopers. In fact, you might face a fine, shunning, or even annulment proceedings if the wrong person petitions the church. And then there's the dowry issue. Without it, your union might lack social legitimacy. In noble families, this was a disaster. Without a formal dowry, any children you have might be considered illegitimate, not barred from love, but definitely barred from inheritance. That's a medieval romance buzzkill. One fringe tidbit here. In 15th century Florence, there was a small but fascinating subculture of professional marriage negotiators who specialized in smoothing over elopements. They'd meet with angry parents, offer restitution, and sometimes even broker a retroactive dowry to legitimize the union. Think of them as medieval couples counselors crossed with shady lawyers. But even if your family forgives you, you're not in the clear. There's still the gossip, always the gossip. A runaway marriage gets tongues wagging for months. She's no better than she ought to be, someone mutters. I heard he used a love spell, whispers another. Suddenly, every cough, trip, or broken egg in the village is blamed on your elopement. You're also expected to prove that your marriage was real, not just emotionally but physically, which, yes, sometimes meant showing the bloodied bedsheets as evidence. Romance. But here's the strange thing. As scandalous as eloping was, people still rooted for you, secretly. Even the loudest moralizers sometimes admired the boldness. Because in a world where matchmaking felt like a slow-motion business deal, runaway love felt wild and brave. You'll likely be fine. You'll build a life, maybe in a neighboring village where your names don't cause church ladies to faint. You'll grow onions together, argue about firewood, and tell your grandkids that theirs was a love worth fleeing for. And that basket weaver, he's probably still trying to write love poems to his neighbor's cousin's daughter's maid. You don't notice the silence at first. The birds have stopped singing. The village dogs, usually yapping at shadows and carts, lie still under the eaves. And the baker, who always starts yelling before dawn, hasn't opened his shutters. Then you smell it. Not the comforting scent of rye and wood smoke, but something darker, acrid, damp, a stink that clings to the wind like guilt. Welcome to the most romance-destroying force of the medieval world, the plague. There's nothing quite like a highly contagious, city-emptying, pustule-erupting epidemic to kill the mood, especially when it shows up every few years like an uninvited dinner guest, dragging death, suspicion, and total social breakdown in its wake. Let's rewind to the Black Death, mid-14th century. It's believed to have killed somewhere between 30% to 60% of Europe's population. That's not just a bad flu season. That's enough corpses to change the very nature of society, from labor wages to fashion trends to, dating rituals. First off, courtship collapses. Who wants to flirt when you can't even trust the water, the air, or your neighbor's sneeze? Gone are the festivals, the feast day dances, and the marketplace mingling. Weddings get postponed indefinitely. Parents keep daughters locked in stone towers, not for virtue, but for survival. And if you so much as brush someone's hand, you're probably wondering if they'll be cold and waxy by Tuesday. There's even a chilling historical footnote. During some plague years, kissing became punishable in certain towns. Public affection, already restrained by social norms, turned practically criminal. Imagine trying to woo someone from 6 feet away with a plague mask on. That brings us to those masks, beaked, haunting, and stuffed with herbs to ward off bad air. While mostly worn by plague doctors, some superstitious folks adopted similar nose cones when illness struck. If your date shows up wearing one, that's not a red flag. That's a red skull and crossbones. But what about love during plague? Not just avoiding it. Strangely enough, the chaos sparked both repression and wild rebellion. Some responded with total austerity. Flagellant groups, for instance, marched from town to town whipping themselves in penitence, believing the plague was divine punishment for sin. Not exactly a sexy vibe. Others, though, took the opposite route. Eat, drink, and love like tomorrow isn't guaranteed became an unspoken motto. Secret trysts increased. So did unsanctioned marriages, hastily done before death could interfere. One record even notes that in certain villages, the number of wedding banns actually increased during plague years, not because people were optimistic, but because they figured they might as well die married. Quirky historical tidbit. In Venice, it was believed that making love under the bridge near the Church of San Steve during a certain lunar phase would keep the plague away. Did it work? Historians still argue whether that was magical thinking or just desperation wrapped in romance. But death doesn't just chase young lovers, it changes the very rules. With so many people gone, inheritance laws shift, giving women more financial freedom in some areas. Widows become hot commodities. In cities like Florence and London, the previously strict dowry markets suddenly loosen. If you're single and survive the plague, you're practically a celebrity. People start marrying faster, younger, and sometimes even for love, not because of family pressure. That said, marriage logistics don't get any easier. Priests are dying. Scribes vanish. Some towns don't have anyone left to write the banns, much less perform the rites. Makeshift ceremonies spring up, under trees in doorways, sometimes whispered through locked shutters. Let's not forget the superstitions. People start treating birthmarks, freckles, or red hair as potential plague signs. Courting someone with any of these marks might get you gossiped about, or worse. The local wise woman might declare your sweetheart cursed, or a witch, or that their parents made a pact with forest spirits. Love, as usual, becomes a risky business. And then there's the heartbreak no one talks about, plague breakups. You might have survived, but your beloved didn't. Or worse, maybe they ran off mid-outbreak, never to return. Maybe you were too afraid to hold their hand while they coughed. Maybe you sat outside their house for days, only to hear the hammering of the coffin boards. Death makes you selfish, or saintly, or numb. If you're still alive months later, the world feels emptier, but also freer. There's space now. Literally, abandoned farms, empty shops, houses with no heirs. You can remarry. You might have to. Life expectancy is a gamble, and companionship, even risky, plaguey companionship, starts to feel worth it. Eventually, the worst passes. The birds come back. The baker opens his shutters again. You go to a fair, half scared, half hopeful, and someone smiles at you across a stall selling moldy pears. They're missing 2 teeth. You don't care. You make eye contact. You don't flinch. And despite everything, your heart does that fluttery thing again. Yes, even in a world with lice, leeches, and flea-ridden rats. Because medieval dating, even in a plague, is about taking the risk, about finding moments of warmth in a world built from stone and soot and silence. Just maybe keep the herbal satchel around your neck, just in case. You wake up from a strange dream. In it, you're marrying someone with a dog's head. There's a full moon, a priest who's also a goat, and your future mother-in-law floats 3 inches off the ground, glowing faintly blue. Weird, right? But in medieval Europe, that's practically a sign from God. Because tonight, your love life is at the mercy of stars, symbols, and squinting old men with charts. Astrology, omens, palm reading, bird watching. Every flicker of nature becomes a divine hint about who you're supposed to marry. Rational matchmaking. That's for the 21st century. Here, you're just a Gemini trying to avoid dying alone in a ditch because the stars said so. Let's say you're interested in the blacksmith's daughter. She has strong hands, nice eyes, and a sense of humor. Excellent. But before anything romantic can happen, you'll need to check her star sign, compare it to yours, and probably consult a village astrophilosopher who smells like burnt garlic and wax. That's not a joke. Horoscopes were serious business in the Middle Ages, especially for the upper classes. Royal marriages were sometimes delayed or rejected based on planetary alignments. Mars in retrograde, weddings off, Mercury rising during harvest season. better marry a monk instead. Even ordinary folks believed in marriage days, specific calendar dates that were considered lucky or cursed. Monday might bring loyalty, while Wednesday could doom your spouse to early death. That's a lot of pressure for someone who just wants to smuggle you a strawberry under the table. Meanwhile, dreams were analyzed with the intensity of modern Reddit forums. Dreamt of fish, fertility, dogs, betrayal, shoes. You're about to meet someone, or be robbed. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed these meanings or just used them to justify feelings they couldn't explain. And let's not forget the bridal divinations. On certain feast nights, like St. Agnes Eve, young people would perform rituals to catch a glimpse of their future spouse. You might sleep with a piece of cake under your pillow, fast all day, then walk backward around a church at midnight. Whisper your crush's name into a well, hoping it echoes back. Romantic, slightly terrifying, definitely. But this obsession with signs wasn't just whimsical. Life was fragile. Plague, famine, war. It all made people crave order in chaos. If the heavens could give structure to suffering, then love, too, must be written in the stars. And when you're living in a one-room cottage with your 5 siblings and a goat named Alois, it's comforting to think that fate, not just local gossip, might decide who you end up with. Still, the signs didn't always make sense. There are records of people marrying the wrong person because their dreams misfired. One Welsh story tells of a girl who dreamed of a rich merchant and married a local fishmonger instead. Turns out the fishmonger became rich later. So, was the dream right or wrong? Scholars still debate. And then there's geomancy, a sort of medieval proto-Google. You'd scatter dirt or sand and read the patterns for clues about your romantic destiny. It's a bit like tea leaf reading, but dustier, and with slightly more risk of accidentally divining that your soulmate is already dead. Of course, not everyone bought into it. Some church authorities frowned heavily on astrology and omens. It's pagan, they'd say. It's heresy. But even bishops quietly asked astrologers about marriage dates, and noble families, desperate for good fortune, kept star charts next to the Bible. You might be wondering, did any of this actually help people find love? Well, kind of. Let's say your sign is compatible with your crush. The village soothsayer blesses your match. Your dreams show swans instead of snakes, and you marry on a Friday during a waning moon, which apparently wards off infidelity. Psychologically, that might actually help. Placebo effect or not, you feel confident. You believe fate is on your side. And in a world where confidence is scarcer than clean socks, that belief might just carry your relationship through some goat-related hardship. On the flip side, if the signs were bad, like your sweetheart was born under Scorpio and you're a Leo, you might give up the entire romance out of fear. Or worse, get married and then blame every squabble on planetary interference. Of course, he forgot your birthday. Venus is in Capricorn. But maybe the strangest thing is how these ancient systems linger. Even today, people ask, "What's your sign?" or check horoscopes just for fun. That medieval hunger to decode the stars didn't vanish, it just updated its interface. There's one more medieval matchmaking marvel we haven't mentioned, the dream oracle. In some monasteries, particularly in Eastern Europe, people could pay monks to sleep and dream on their behalf. You'd ask a question, "Will I marry the miller's son?" And the monk would try to receive a divine answer in his sleep. Now, whether he actually dreamed anything or just made it up after a particularly spicy supper, we'll never know. But it was a service. And sometimes, those sleepy prophecies turned entire love stories around. So here you are, in your scratchy tunic, heart thumping, hands cold, standing beneath the stars. You think of the omens, the dreams, the priest with the oddly specific mole who said you'd marry someone with broad feet and a voice like thunder. Then you see them, your maybe future, carrying a basket of onions and smiling like they've just won a duel with a cow. You check their boots, broad feet, you gulp. And you take the chance. Because no matter what the stars say, or the dreams whisper, or the dust suggests, one thing remains true in every century. You'll never find out if you don't say hello. The wedding bells aren't bells at all. They're sheep bleating outside, and your new brother-in-law throwing a stick at a chicken that's gotten too bold. Because you did it, you got married, you survived medieval dating. Congratulations. Your honeymoon starts not in a candle-lit room, but in a house you now share with 3 in-laws, 1 cow, 2 goats, 6 chickens, and because nothing says romance like the sound of distant chewing, your new spouse's elderly uncle who talks in his sleep. There's no privacy. The bedroom, if you can call it that, is just a curtained-off corner of the main room. The bed is stuffed with straw that squeaks with every shift, and the family, they're definitely still awake, whispering loudly about whether your mother gave enough bread at the ceremony. Still, you lie beside your new spouse, sweaty from dancing, faintly smelling of boiled cabbage, and try to remember why people do this. Oh, right, because this is the goal. You're married now. You've entered the final form of medieval romance. But marriage back then wasn't the fairy tale finish line. It was the beginning of a long, shared economic contract. Love was optional, survival was not. For peasant couples, the marriage meant shared labor. You milk goats, they spin wool. You tend the barley, they cook porridge. You both try not to die of frostbite in February. Your romance now hinges on whether they remember to cover the grain sacks when it rains, and whether you can make a joke about manure that actually lands. Sexy? No. Stable? Sometimes. Among the nobility, the stakes are higher, and the stakes are mostly political. You marry not for love, but to strengthen alliances. There are treaties signed alongside your vows. You might meet your spouse for the first time on your wedding day and spend the reception listening to your uncle mutter, "Well, at least they've got good teeth." And then, of course, there's the bedding ceremony. It's less romantic than it sounds. In some places, you're paraded to bed with half the village watching. They might sing. They might throw grain. They might literally tuck you in while commenting on your sleeping posture. Historians still argue whether these public bedding customs were symbolic or actually observed. Either way, you're probably too tired to care. You've danced, eaten, survived 4 toasts and 1 near stabbing between cousins. You just want to sleep. But even once the wedding is over, the social expectations never end. There are rules now about when to consummate, how many children to have, how to behave at church. If you fight, expect the local priest to get involved. If you separate, you might be publicly shamed. And if your spouse dies within a year, you'll be accused of being cursed, sinful, or secretly a hedgehog in human form. And yes, animal-themed insults were a thing. Even the sleeping arrangement is a negotiation. Beds are expensive. Blankets are shared. Lice are shared more. If you're lucky, the livestock sleeps near the bed, not in it. And yet somehow, people made it work. Some couples grew close over time, sharing routines, jokes, hardships. They knew each other's moods like clockwork. They passed on family songs, stories, recipes. They held hands under the table during bad harvests. They made it through. Others didn't. There were medieval divorces, though rare, legal annulments, informal separations. In one case, a couple faked their deaths to get out of a marriage, only to be caught when they both turned up at the same market pretending to be cousins. And as always, superstition lingered. If the marriage went badly, people blamed the stars, or that dream about the bleeding rooster, or the fact that you accidentally dropped your wedding bread upside down. But sometimes, amid the mess, between the muddy floors and the sniffly goats, you'd catch a moment of something real. A quiet chuckle while shelling peas, a wink during church, a shared smile when the neighbor falls into the pig pen again. Because love, despite the odds, occasionally slipped through the cracks. It wasn't candlelit letters or violin serenades. It was bringing someone a warm turnip on a cold day. It was remembering that your partner hates onions and always leaves their shoes near the fire. It was tiny things, unrecorded things. And now here you are, married, uncomfortable, half asleep, listening to the snores of livestock and your new life partner. Not quite the fairy tale, but weirdly kind of perfect. And now, listener, it's time to soften the pace. Let the clamor of the feast fade behind you. Let the smoke of the hearth curl away like a sleepy breath. The room grows quieter, warmer. Your new world settles into stillness. The goat nudges its hay. The last ember on the fire cracks with a sigh. Your hand rests near someone else's, calloused fingers, gentle touch. Maybe not the love story you imagined, but one that's real, rooted, earned. The ceiling above is low and wooden, with spider webs in the corners. But beyond it, out there, the stars still shimmer. The same stars they once believed chose your fate. Tonight they don't speak. They simply shine. Let your eyes close now. Let the scratchy wool and straw mattress be enough. Let the soft hum of a snoring house lull you deeper. You've made it through medieval love, the awkward glances, the coded songs, the astrology, the public bed checks, and the livestock-laced vows. And now finally you rest. Wrapped in silence, cradled by time, carried gently through a world that once was. SHHH. Sweet dreams.